Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is the place where we take your carefully curated stack of sources. Articles, research papers, sometimes an entire book we lock ourselves in, and we really don't emerge until we've distilled the absolute key insights you need to be brilliantly informed.
And today we are undertaking a truly monumental mission. We're covering 1,000 years of global history. We're doing a deep dive into comparative world history, specifically focused on this concept called the Great Divergence.
Right, the moment when Western Europe just pulled decisively ahead of the rest of the world, economically and technologically.
Exactly, between the years 1000 and 2000. And our main source material, this book, Two Paths to Prosperity, it argues that the foundations for the modern world, well, they were laid centuries ago. It wasn't some sudden stroke of genius in the 18th century.
No, it was about these profoundly different, really persistent choices societies made about how to organize themselves.
That's the core of it.
And the central puzzle here isn't just about divergence. It's what the source is calling the Great Reversal. Because if you traveled back in time, say, to 1250, right in the middle of China's Song dynasty.
Oh, you would have bet everything on the East.
Every single penny. They were, you could argue, far ahead of Europe on almost every single measure of civilization, of technology, of economic complexity.
Absolutely. The Song dynasty was in the middle of what you can only really describe as a sustained golden age. They had these advanced technologies that Europe, they wouldn't master them for centuries.
And we're talking about foundational technologies, things that define global power.
The big ones. What Sir Francis Bacon famously called his big three.
Printing, gunpowder, and the compass.
Exactly. And these weren't just, little experiments in a workshop. They were integrated into the very fabric of their society, their bureaucracy, their military.
And the sheer industrial capacity is what to assess. It's astounding when you read the numbers. The source points out that in 1078, northern China alone was producing over 114,000 tons of pig iron a year. Let that number sink in.
That is more than double the entire output of England at the beginning of the 18th century. That's 700 years later. They had mass production of iron casting, sophisticated ships.
With watertight compartments, rudder controls.
Advanced textiles, paper manufacturing, really complex hydraulic technology for their agriculture. It's just a different world.
It was. They had a highly commercialized, urbanized economy. They had paper money. They had a meritocratic bureaucracy that was recruiting the best talent from all over the country.
So the central puzzle we have to try and solve in this deep dive is not why Europe eventually industrialized, but why China, starting from such an incredible commanding lead, why did they stagnate, relatively speaking, after that Song period?
And the source's answer is that the difference wasn't just technology or geography, though, those things play a role.
Of course.
It was a deep fundamental split. A bifurcation in culture and social organization that actually began centuries earlier. So our mission today is to trace those two different paths, one that's all about kinship, the other about corporations. And we're going to see how they defined two completely different ways of managing cooperation, of supporting markets, of structuring the state, and how that set the stage for everything that followed.
Okay, let's unpack this core bifurcation because it is, it's the linchpin of the entire argument in our source material.
It really is.
The whole story of this great divergence, according to this analysis, it just comes down to a really basic problem. How do you solve cooperation and trust at the local level?
That is the crux of it, yeah. In China, cooperation was built primarily on these extended kin networks. We call them clans. And trust was intense. It was deep, but it was very localized.
So it's what scholars call communitarian or limited morality.
Exactly. Your loyalty, your trust, it was incredibly strong, but it was restricted. To your immediate kin, maybe your fellow villagers, your clan, anyone outside that. An outsider, a stranger, they were treated with a lot of suspicion. And Europe, almost by accident, moves towards something else, towards what's called universalistic or generalized morality.
Right.
Which is this idea that you can apply the same norms of good conduct, of trust, of ethical obligation to strangers, not just your blood relatives. And that is a massive social shift.
It's a profound shift. And our sources make this really compelling case that the engine of that change was the Latin Catholic Church. It's credited with what they call accidental genius.
Accidental genius, I like that.
For unintentionally engineering the collapse of traditional tribalism and these big extended kin networks in Europe, starting way back in the early Middle Ages.
Okay, wait. How does a religious organization whose main goal is, spiritual guidance, accidentally dismantle the most fundamental social unit there is, the extended family?
By launching a very deliberate, centuries-long policy campaign against the very practices that traditionally held those kin networks together.
They weren't subtle about it.
Not at all. As you noted in the outline, they systematically discouraged or just outright banned the practices that cemented large family alliances. Things like adoption, polygamy, concubinage,
And the big one.
and the absolute biggest one from a socioeconomic perspective, the ban on consanguineous or cousin marriage. They kept expanding the degrees of prohibition for who you could marry, pushing it out to more and more distant relatives.
So why was that ban on cousin marriage such a critical lever? What did that specifically do?
Well, just think about the practicalities of a traditional agrarian society. If you're a large family, you need to hold on to your land, your power, your political alliances.
Right, land is everything.
Everything. So if you marry your first or second cousin, you are ensuring that your valuable inherited land, your wealth, your local political power, it all stays concentrated right there within your established kinship structure.
But the church's ban forces European elites, and eventually everyone else, to find marriage partners outside of that immediate kin group. So if you have to marry outside your circle, your land holdings just get fragmented over generations, and the political alliances you're making are necessarily with strangers.
Exactly. And that just chips away at the economic and political viability of the big extended landholding clan.
So the unintentional result then is the rise of what's called the European marriage pattern, or EMP.
Right. And this pattern, it featured a much smaller, more economically independent nuclear family. And crucially, it established this principle of neolocality.
Neolocality, so the new couple moves out.
The newly married couple would typically set up their own household, separate from both sets of parents. And this just systematically weakened the extended family as the main economic and social building block. It forced people to look for cooperation elsewhere.
So by taking apart the tribal or kin-based nature of European society, the church, maybe without meaning to, created this vacuum.
A huge vacuum.
It laid the foundation for cooperation between people who were unrelated, because those other organizations had to emerge to solve basic problems, providing public goods, managing trade risks, resolving disputes.
The old kin network was just too weak to handle it anymore.
And this vacuum gets filled by other things. I mean, the sources mention that while the church was the catalyst, you also have this rise of philosophical individualism from Greek thought, the rediscovery of Roman law.
All of that provided the intellectual and legal frameworks you need to support cooperation between abstract, unrelated people. And even changes in European agriculture, more livestock, which meant more economic roles for women, that contributed to later marriage ages and neolocality, just reinforcing the whole effect.
Okay, so let's flip this and contrast it with China, where the kin-based system didn't just persist, it actively flourished. It became the absolute bedrock of society for centuries.
In China, the clan system was just deeply rooted in patriarchy and ancestor worship, which gives you this incredibly strong, unifying cultural glue that works across generations.
And this wasn't just tolerated, right? The government was actively involved.
It was formalized and systematized by Neo-Confucianism during the Song dynasty and actively encouraged by the imperial government.
Okay, hold on. If you're the emperor and you want centralized power, why on earth would you actively encourage strong local clans? Doesn't that create little power centers that could challenge the state? This is that sovereign's dilemma you mentioned.
And that's exactly where the paradox is. The central government followed this Confucian principle of minimal interference at the local level. They had to govern this massive, diverse empire with a relatively tiny, centralized bureaucracy.
So the clan was the solution.
The clan was the perfect non-state mechanism to solve the local governance dilemma. Clans were crucial. They provided essential local public goods, like maintaining granaries, helping the poor, housing refugees, and most importantly, handling dispute resolution.
So it kept all that messy local stuff out of the imperial magistrate's court.
Exactly. The state gets stability. It keeps its direct administrative costs way down by essentially outsourcing local order and welfare to the clan structure.
So it's functional delegation. The state relies on customs, what they call lai, enforced by these co-opted local elites, the gentry, instead of a huge, expensive, and maybe rebellious national bureaucracy.
Precisely. And the economic changes during the Song era actually made the need for this strong clan structure even more intense.
How so? The Song period was one of incredible economic dynamism.
It was dynamic, but also socially fragmented. You had huge population growth, urbanization, agricultural revolutions, new high-yield rice varieties from Vietnam.
And also partible inheritance.
Yes, the cultural practice of partible inheritance, dividing assets equally among the male heirs. This created a constant existential threat. Your family's wealth, your land, could be fragmented into tiny, unviable little plots within 2 or 3 generations.
And the clan provides the safety net.
It provides stability. It acts as a pool of shared resources and a social safety net that softens the blow of that fragmentation.
And this was really tied to specific agricultural technology, wasn't it? Especially in the South.
Very much so. The source highlights that the rice-growing regions, particularly in South China, just inherently needed more cooperation than, say, the dry-field wheat farming of the north.
July.
Because rice cultivation requires these incredibly intricate shared irrigation systems.
Yeah.
You have ditches, levees, pumps, coordinated planting schedules. It absolutely mandates communal policing and constant high-trust interaction between neighbors to maintain it all.
Right. If one family lets their part of the dish get clogged, the whole system fails for everyone.
Your whole village's crop could be ruined. So the technology of the rice paddy itself demanded high trust and cooperation. And the pre-existing kin structures, the clans, were the perfect social organization to provide that trust and reciprocity.
It's a brilliant example of technology and social organization just locking into this self-reinforcing loop.
It really is. What you see here is this powerful feedback loop. The organizational structure reinforces the cultural values, and the values reinforce the structure. In China, all these inter-kin interactions reinforce loyalty to kin, communitarian values.
And in Europe, all these interactions among socially distant, unrelated people forced by the EMP reinforced generalized trust and universalistic values.
Which made these non-kin organizational forms not just possible, but viable. And this coevolution, starting centuries ago, created the fundamental bifurcation that ultimately led to the Great Reversal.
So this cultural split kin first versus universal trust, it had these profound consequences. It gives rise to two completely different organizational models, which we can see playing out in key institutions on both sides. Let's start with Europe and the corporation.
The European corporation was a historical novelty. I mean, these were bottom-up voluntary associations of unrelated individuals. They didn't emerge because of some grand design.
They emerged because they had to.
They had to, exactly. In politically fragmented Europe, they had to emerge to solve collective action problems, protecting property, funding trade, building public works, that the weak kin networks couldn't solve and the fragmented states couldn't manage.
So the church accidentally weakens the family, and the chaos that follows in governance creates this opportunity for new forms of organization to just step right in.
Precisely. And the church itself provided the organizational template. You look at the early examples, monasteries and convents, the famous Cluny order in the 10th and 11th centuries.
What was that?
It was essentially an early transnational corporation. It governed hundreds of properties scattered across Europe, thousands of unrelated people who all chose to commit to cooperative behavior under a clear written set of rules. They were resilient, they were wealthy, and they were legally distinct from the people who ran them.
And then you see these secular urban groups start to pop up, like the fraternities.
Right, these religious and social associations. And it's so telling that they emphasized brotherhood, a term of shared obligation and commitment, rather than cousinhood.
It's a choice of metaphor.
It is. They were oath-bound associations. They often provided charity and social insurance to non-kin members and the wider community, which reflects that generalized, universalistic morality that was becoming necessary in cities where most people were strangers. It was a critical cultural bridge.
And these groups didn't just operate on a handshake. They got a huge boost from a legal revolution that happened around the 12th and 13th centuries.
That period codified the features that made these associations incredibly powerful and durable. The legal innovation granted them status as separate legal entities.
Meaning the group could own property, sign contracts, sue, or be sued.
All independent of its individual members. And it also provided something called entity shielding.
Wait, entity shielding? That sounds like a modern legal term you'd hear for a Silicon Valley startup. What did that mean for, say, a 13th century guild? Was it literally protecting the members' personal assets?
That is exactly the concept, yes. Though it wasn't really called limited liability for most private groups until much later. But entity shielding separated the assets and liabilities of the organization from the assets and liabilities of its members.
So if the corporate entity, let's say the city of Bruges, gets into debt, the individual shoemakers and merchants aren't necessarily on the hook personally for that debt.
Right, and that durability, that legal separation, made corporations stronger, more resilient, and ultimately allowed them to acquire significant political rights and the ability to tax.
That mechanism must have fundamentally changed the risk calculation for getting into big ventures with strangers.
It absolutely did. It lowered the risk profile of cooperation, which was essential in that fragmented European environment.
Hmm.
And you can see this organizational need reflected so clearly in migration patterns.
Oh,
European migration was generally individual or nuclear family-based. If you moved to a new city like Venice or Genoa or even to the New World centuries later, you were forced to cooperate with strangers and form these spontaneous, non-kin corporations just to survive and trade.
and the Chinese contrast here is just stark.
Totally different. Chinese migration was fundamentally kin-based. When people moved to a frontier, they didn't just bring their immediate family. The goal was to, and I'm quoting here, construct a new kin group on the frontier for the purpose of land clearance and developing an irrigation infrastructure.
So they relied on their existing high-trust kin structures to manage the risk of a new environment instead of inventing new corporate ones.
That's right.
Okay, let's focus on the economic organizations that became so dominant in Europe. The guilds, European guilds, both merchant and craft, were incredibly influential.
They were these complex, multifunctional organizations that grew out of those earlier fraternities. And yes, they regulated the economy, setting standards, controlling prices, managing the whole apprenticeship system, but their functions went way beyond just economics.
They had huge political and social roles.
Massive. They ran charities, provided comprehensive social insurance for widows, orphans, the sick, and significantly, they directly influenced city governance.
So the European Guild was like a mini government. It had police power, charity power, political power, often operating in the symbiotic relationship with the city government. Now, they definitely helped the commercial revolution by providing security and arbitration where the state was weak, but I know their impact is hotly debated by historians.
Oh, it is. While they solved cooperation problems, they also very quickly became these powerful cartels. They engaged in classic anti-competitive rent-seeking behavior, restricting entry, raising prices, fighting against disruptive innovation. But the core point here is their structural breadth.
And how did that compare to Chinese guilds?
Chinese guilds, which also existed, were primarily just simple economic associations. They were focused on trade regulation, quality control, maybe pricing. But crucially, they lacked the broader social, religious, and political functions that were so central to their European counterparts.
And why? Because all those other functions, social insurance, charity, local dispute resolution, were already being handled efficiently by the lineage organizations, the clans.
Exactly. The Chinese system was functionally partitioned. The clan handled welfare and local order, the state handled administration and law, and the guilds handled very niche economic issues. Chinese guilds didn't play a formal role in city governance. That was the job of the imperial magistrates' administration, supported by the gentry and the clan structures.
So that lack of political authority meant Chinese guilds could never grow into the powerful, self-governing political corporations that the European communes became.
Never. And this bifurcation, this split in cooperation models, is maybe nowhere clearer or more consequential than in the path taken for higher education. I mean, the ultimate source of the Industrial Revolution was knowledge creation.
And the contrast is just staggering.
It really is. European universities, like Bologna and Paris, they emerged spontaneously. They were decentralized, competitive corporations dedicated to transmitting and critically generating knowledge. They were organizations that formed under a papal charter or royal protection, but they remained independent entities, free from direct, top-down state control.
And that institutional independence must have been absolutely key for intellectual freedom.
Vital. Their status as autonomous corporations fostered skepticism, a willingness to contradict established dogma, whether that was the Catholic Church or the classical canon of Aristotle. This created a competitive market for ideas, which was essential for the later scientific revolution.
They were also central to reviving and growing formal legal theory, especially Roman law.
Yes, creating a professional class of legal experts, again, outside of the direct control of any single king or emperor.
And in China, education was almost the polar opposite, entirely state-directed and controlled.
The Chinese education system was utterly dominated by the imperial civil service examination, the Kiju system. Now, this system was undeniably meritocratic. It was a phenomenal path for commoners to move up the social ladder based on intellectual talent. But its goal was very specific and inherently conservative.
It was designed to find the best candidates for public administration.
That was its sole purpose. It sounds like a fantastic screening mechanism for finding loyal, capable bureaucrats, but maybe a terrible one for generating new disruptive ideas.
Exactly. The Kanju system required this deep specialization in the Confucian classics. It focused intellectual energy almost entirely on mastering and interpreting ancient knowledge. The best and brightest minds were all channeled into a single state bureaucracy, which just reinforced intellectual conservatism and a profound respect for the wisdom of the ancients.
So the emperor became the dominant, if not the monopolistic, player in the market for ideas.
And if the state is the only major employer of top intellectual talent and the curriculum is backward-looking, well, then curiosity gets directed away from empirical science or disruptive technology.
Precisely. You know, many of the great song inventions were actually made by bureaucrats themselves, who were incentivized by promotion, not by private economic reward. So once the Ming and Qing dynasties became politically conservative and inward-looking, that centralized flow of innovation just slowed to a trickle.
Because the decentralized, competitive institutions that could foster private, risky knowledge creation, they simply didn't exist.
You just weren't there.
Yeah.
So these organizational paths that were taken, kinship networks versus corporations, they directly determine the political and legal trajectories of the two civilizations, especially when it comes to the relationship between state power and social innovation.
And Europe's trajectory was defined by this long-term political fragmentation. Since the 5th century, Western Europe just lacked a single, unified, secular ruler. Geography played a role, sure, but the church, as we've talked about, was instrumental in making sure no single king or emperor got strong enough to dominate the whole continent and challenge its authority.
And this fragmentation, while it led to constant devastating warfare that killed millions, it had this paradoxical long-term benefit for economic and intellectual development.
It created a competitive state system.
It did. And this competition meant that if you were an innovator, an intellectual, a Copernicus, a Galileo, a Spinoza, the state wasn't your only source of patronage or persecution.
You had the critical exit option.
The exit option. If a sovereign in one state banned your book or censored your teaching or persecuted you for heresy, you could just pack your bags and move to a neighboring jurisdiction that was maybe more tolerant.
Or maybe just saw an economic or military advantage in adopting your new technology or accepting your controversial ideas.
Exactly. And this intellectual mobility acted as a fundamental check on reactionary rulers. No state could afford to consistently mistreat its most productive or innovative citizens without watching them walk across the border and empower a rival.
And this pressure strengthened the Republic of Letters.
Yes, that virtual, transnational network of scholars, printers, and thinkers that just operated across state boundaries. This network fostered contestability and made censorship largely ineffective across the whole of Europe.
The political power of the self-governing cities was also critical here for sustaining that pluralism. These urban communes were themselves incredibly successful, legally recognized corporations. They operated with a degree of exclusive control over their territories.
They were the financial engine of Europe. And thanks to their participatory governance, these cities had a highly efficient fiscal capacity. They could collect taxes from their wealthy merchant citizens far more effectively than the big territorial states could.
And that taxing power gave them immense bargaining leverage against the kings and emperors,
who were chronically short of money, especially with all the endemic European wars.
So the cities basically used their financial muscle to buy political rights.
That's exactly what they did. In exchange for financial support, sovereigns had to concede political rights. And that often took the form of representation in national parliaments, something that occurred only in Europe because you had these strong corporate organizations, cities, guilds, monasteries, that could act as institutional countervailing powers to the central state.
Okay, now let's contrast that competitive pluralism with China, which followed the path of the unified autocratic state based on centuries of early state formation.
China has maintained a unified polity for most of the period since the Mongol conquest in 1279. Its system was incredibly stable, rooted in the centralized meritocratic bureaucracy, the Kiju system that co-opted local elites, the gentry, into serving the central state.
Great for geopolitical stability, but ultimately it lacked that competitive pressure you need for institutional evolution.
Right. And let's go back to that paradox you mentioned. The state was getting more and more autocratic, yet its administrative capacity was actually waning. The sovereign's dilemma in practice.
It's a profound dilemma.
It is. In order to ensure the regime survived and to prevent internal rebellions, the emperors consciously weakened central elites and centralized military power. But this constant focus on security came at the cost of state capacity. The administration became dangerously thin.
I mean, the numbers are shocking.
They are. Between 1700 and 1800, the population of China more than doubled, yet the number of counties, the basic administrative units, barely increased at all.
So you have a single magistrate responsible for this enormous, unmanageable population with minimal administrative resources.
And that gap in enforcement and local governance was filled by the very institutions the central state relied upon, the clans and the gentry. The state traded administrative reach for stability.
Used a trade-off.
A huge trade-off. And when Chinese dynasties fell, it was rarely because a rival state successfully conquered them, like was common in Europe. It was almost always due to internal collapse. Massive peasant rebellions like the Taiping or successful invasions from the unified northern border.
So the threats China faced were largely unidirectional, which just reinforced the need for a single, unified center and actively discouraged the formation of any strong local power blocks.
Which brings us to the resulting legal systems. European law was bottom-up, driven by the needs of commerce among strangers.
Right. The need for cooperation among unrelated people and trade in the commercial revolution created this intense demand for external enforcement and reliable legal institutions.
Legal principles were first hammered out in private contracts, merchant best practices, the lex mercatoria, and then later codified. The rediscovery of Roman law, combined with canon law, created the ius commune, a professional, transnational, standardized legal system that prioritized civil law.
And this system formalized principles that are essential for modern liberal societies: equality before the law and the fundamental right of consent.
Derived from the Roman principle, quote, omnis tangit, meaning matters that concern all should be approved by all. It established a framework for representative governance.
Chinese law, by contrast, was predominantly top-down.
Overwhelmingly, it focused on maintaining peace, stability, and governing state-subject relations. In short, penal and criminal law. Civil law was secondary because all those commercial, debt, and property disputes.
They were routinely settled informally by the clans.
Through arbitration and compromise, which just reinforces that communitarian ethos. The imperial state consciously avoided civil litigation. The magistrates' court, the yamen, it was truly a last resort.
And this difference in legal philosophy really speaks volumes about that underlying moral split. You see it so vividly in how imperial law was carried out.
Yes. European criminal law, though harsh, it gradually moved away from status-based punishments towards some degree of formal equality. Chinese imperial law, however, maintained penalties that were explicitly dependent on kinship hierarchy.
Give us an example.
A son killing a father faced the most severe punishment possible because it was a violation of the hierarchy, whereas a father killing a son, he might face a light punishment, or maybe just a reproof.
Because it reflected the father's hierarchical authority within the clan structure.
Exactly. It's a powerful illustration of how the state's law was ultimately secondary to the ancient moral order of the kin system.
And consider the agents of state enforcement, the yamen runners.
They were necessary to enforce the state's will, but they were universally despised. They were seen as low status, immoral social outcasts, precisely because they were often forced to enforce laws that went against their moral obligation to their own kin or their local community.
So they were the visible embodiment of that conflict between communitarian duties and state demands.
Which made them profoundly unreliable proxies for state power and just further eroded the central administrative capacity at the local level.
So the evidence is really mounting here. The institutional and cultural foundations laid centuries earlier were crucial to why the Industrial Revolution happened in Europe and not in China. China's sophisticated, centralized structure. It was designed for stability, but it failed to foster that specific kind of decentralized, contestable innovation you needed for that dramatic economic leap.
And this is where the cultural environment fostered by Europe's organizational structure becomes absolutely central. I'm talking about the Republic of Letters.
Right.
This was a pan-European weak ties network, so people exchanging ideas with socially distant, non-kin individuals that scanned borders and incentivized, distributed, and rigorously tested new propositional knowledge. This was the foundation of the Industrial Enlightenment.
And this network was successful precisely because of Europe's generalized morality and institutional support, the independent universities, the competitive state system.
It established a foundational commitment to contestability and skepticism. All statements, all hypotheses, all results were subject to critical public examination, regardless of the status of the person proposing them.
And this reliance on verifiable evidence, the commitment to publication, what we now call open science, it replaced the secrecy and proprietary knowledge that was previously used to protect valuable trade secrets.
And there was a profound cultural shift that came before all this. Curiosity itself transformed from something that was traditionally viewed with suspicion, maybe even as a sin.
Pandora opening the box.
Exactly. It transformed into a virtue, driving the pursuit of useful knowledge and the challenging of the classical canon.
Now, contrast that intellectual environment with China. The conservative bias inherent in ancestor worship and elder dominance meant that curiosity was largely directed inward and backward.
Intellectual energy was focused on deeply interpreting the real meanings of the writings of past sages. Respect for ancient knowledge often translated into suspicion of anything that was perceived as entirely novel, heretical, or deviant.
There's a quote from a mathematician, Mei Wending, late in the Qing dynasty in 1693. He argued that moderns were in no way superior to the ancients and that there was no true historical progress in knowledge.
That view just fundamentally undermines the engine of continuous, radical innovation.
And the Industrial Revolution wasn't purely an intellectual affair, right? It relied heavily on the artisanal elite.
The clockmakers, instrument makers, millwrights, engineers like James Watt, these were the mindful hands, the people who fused theoretical knowledge, the propositional, with practical skill, the prescriptive.
And transmitting these complex, practical skills was crucial for building human capital, and that depended entirely on the institution of apprenticeship. But this institution is, by its nature, a non-repeated, long-term contract between two unrelated people, the master and the pupil.
And that relationship is highly susceptible to contractual problems, specifically moral hazard. How do you make sure the master really invests time in training the pupil if the pupil might just run off and use the training somewhere else?
And how do you make sure the pupil commits to that long, low-wage training period? It's a fundamental commitment problem between non-kin.
And the answer, yet again, lies in the corporate structure.
Of course.
They solved the commitment problem through the corporation. Craft guilds, these associations of non-kin individuals, often supported by local government, were instrumental. They regulated the apprenticeship contract. They enforced compliance through sanctions like compulsory membership or blackballing.
So a master who broke the contract could lose his standing, and an apprentice who ran off could be denied the ability to ever become a master in that city or trade.
Exactly. The guild structure provided the necessary generalized trust and external enforcement, a function the kin structure just couldn't provide, to scale up technical training and skill transmission in Europe. This reliance on formal non-kin-based cooperation was the key to creating a highly skilled, mobile artisanal class that, by 1750, was pulling way ahead of their Asian counterparts in basic mechanical tech.
Meanwhile, in China, innovation was often centralized, driven by government officials like with those state-sponsored agricultural treatises.
And the reverse happened. When the imperial court became conservative, as it did under the Ming and Qing, private, decentralized innovation just lacked the necessary market structures and non-kin institutional support to take off and scale.
And the result was a stagnation that transformed a great lead into a great reversal. This sweeping historical view brings us right up to the modern era, where we hit what the source calls the modern paradox. China has achieved truly stunning, unprecedented economic growth since 1980. I mean, arguably the fastest industrialization in human history.
It really is.
Yet it's done so despite having institutions that, by classic Western development standards, are often considered weak or just absent.
We're talking about the lack of an independent rule of law, poorly defined or protected private property rights, and financial markets that are heavily repressed or state-controlled. Most Western development economists would tell you that robust, Western-style universalistic institutions are an absolute precondition for sustained growth.
And China's success seems to just defy that rule.
It does.
So the source argues that China's modern success isn't a break from its past, but actually a remarkable and highly successful adaptation and reemergence of those historical organizational patterns. The path to prosperity didn't converge with the West. It found a highly successful new version of the historical Chinese path.
That's it, exactly. And the first key persistence is the reemergence and adaptation of the kinship and Guangxi network.
Right.
Mao's massive, often brutal efforts to eradicate kin-based culture failed. After his death, kinship ties, clan organizations, often marked by compiling these huge genealogies and personal networks, Guangxi, just re-emerged as central functional features of social and economic life, especially for private entrepreneurs.
Guangxi is often translated as connections or relationships, but In this context, it's acting as a critical substitute institution for a weak rule of law. How does that work in practice for a business owner today?
It fulfills two critical needs. First, it provides access to capital. Family and clan networks are often the only reliable source of large-scale investment for entrepreneurs who are shut out of the state-dominated financial system.
Okay.
Second, and you could argue this is the most crucial part, these networks provide protection from government interference, or what economists call the grabbing hand of the state.
So if your business is owned and operated within a strong clan network, local officials are less likely to arbitrarily seize your assets or demand excessive bribes.
Precisely. Kinship ties and clan associations act as a buffer. They provide collective monitoring against local officials. They give you stability and protection for your private assets where the formal legal system is untrustworthy or easily manipulated by the state.
It's a direct parallel to the clan's function in Imperial China, where it stepped in to provide public order when the state was weak. Now it steps in to provide asset protection when the state's legal system is weak.
And the data strongly backs this up. It suggests the clan is still a functional alternative to formal legal institutions.
What does it show?
Research shows that clan strength is positively correlated with the fraction and the performance of family-owned firms in China. And what's more, the historical reliance on lineage ties actually facilitated China's modern global integration.
How?
The Chinese diaspora, relying on these pre-existing lineage and Guangxi connections, they acted as key intermediaries when foreign firms, especially from Hong Kong and Taiwan, started entering mainland China after 1980. They were leveraging centuries of social organization for modern commerce.
The second persistence is in the state structure itself, which the book describes as decentralized authoritarianism, a very distinct departure from the corporate pluralism of the West.
This modern system retains several key imperial features. You have an authoritarian, unaccountable central government that maintains tight control over ideology and intellectual life, much like the imperial court controlled the Kiju curriculum.
And you have a vast meritocratic bureaucracy.
Now it's the party cadres, selected and promoted by the center. They are loyal only upward, not downward to the local people.
And the economic engine is driven by intense competition at the local level.
Yes, the system is competitive, but it's a competition for political status, enforced by a central personnel control system. Economic responsibility for growth is massively decentralized to local governments, provinces, counties.
So these local officials have a lot of autonomy.
Wide policy autonomy, promoting reforms, transferring land, facilitating credit. They are engaged in this fierce tournament of cadres, all vying for a promotion based primarily on the economic outcomes in their jurisdiction.
So instead of competing states or self-governing cities like in fragmented Europe, China has fiercely competitive local officials who drive growth, but they have zero accountability to the local citizens they govern.
And that lack of local accountability is the crucial difference. It allows for rapid experimental policy implementation, but it also enables the persistence of historical weaknesses, especially corruption.
The imperial system, lacking direct oversight, suffered from widespread corruption among its low-level enforcers, those despised yamen runners.
And that weakness persists today in modern forms of collective corruption.
How so?
Well, without an independent judiciary or local democratic accountability, corruption is endemic. The historical problem of low reputation enforcers is replaced by modern forms of rent-seeking, where subordinates transfer rents to their superiors in exchange for a promotion. This creates vast networks of personal ties between officials and business people, the polar opposite of the generalized trust and universalistic legal system that Europe needed for its leap forward.
Which is why Xi Jinping's massive anti-graft campaign launched in 2012 has been so necessary.
It functions almost like the old imperial censorate, a tool for the central power to restore legitimacy, check the power of rival factions, and consolidate control over the bureaucracy. It's battling this deeply ingrained historical weakness.
And even recent legal reforms aimed at streamlining things have simultaneously ensured that judges and law enforcement remain firmly tools of the party.
The system ensures the law is an instrument to govern the people and maintain state dominance, rather than acting as an independent framework that is equal for all citizens.
So that lack of legal separation means political predation and abuse remain a risk for even the most successful entrepreneurs. The ancient dynamic endures. Stability of the regime is prioritized over state strength or individual economic security, a calculation that has defined the Chinese path for 1,000 years. Hashtag tag 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 outro. What an incredible analysis, tracing this fundamental difference between two great civilizations all the way back to how they structured cooperation and trust. The central thesis we've drawn from the source is just, it's so clear. The paths to prosperity for Europe and China were set centuries ago, determined by fundamental choices on how to organize and scale cooperation.
And Europe chose to scale cooperation among strangers using corporations and universalistic values.
Often because of the accidental dismantling of kin ties by the medieval church and the pressures of political fragmentation.
While China chose to rely on extended kin networks, clans, and a highly centralized meritocratic bureaucracy, this gave them exceptional stability and a way to manage a vast territory. But it inherently constrained the kind of decentralized intellectual and commercial competition you needed for that dramatic technological leap that defined the Industrial Revolution.
Europe's ability to create durable, large-scale, non-kin cooperation, whether it was through monasteries, guilds, independent universities, or eventually the modern business corporation, that is what enabled the intellectual and economic leap, even if the origins were harsh and competitive.
The competitive pressure, the exit option. It allowed the competitive Republic of Letters to flourish, making ideas contestable and generating new, useful knowledge at an accelerating rate.
The Chinese path, though, provides the world with this immense modern paradox. It has achieved unparalleled economic success by adapting ancient social organizations, like the clan and centralized authoritarian bureaucracy, to modern capitalism. It allowed it to bypass certain institutional demands like independent rule of law and generalized trust that characterize the Western path.
Right.
Which raises an important question for you to mull over as you digest all this history. If the European path was fueled by these decentralized, competitive intellectual systems, the Republic of Letters, independent universities, skilled artisans supported by non-kin guilds, what challenges will China face in the 21st century? Particularly around sustained fundamental innovation if its unique governance structure is inherently limited in its capacity to foster that kind of open, competitive intellectual environment. Is stability achieved through political control ultimately incompatible with the kind of radical, decentralized knowledge creation needed to maintain the technological frontier?